The Galactic Council had invited every spacefaring civilization to witness humanity's first official presentation. Ambassador Marcus Chen stood before the floor-to-ceiling viewport of the summit station, watching Earth rotate below like a blue marble suspended in infinite darkness. No one outside the human delegation knew what was really coming. They thought this was just another routine acceptance ceremony for a primitive species that had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. They had no idea that the humans weren't here to beg for acceptance. They were here to teach the galaxy a lesson about what they'd been ignoring for 300 years. Below, in the briefing chambers, the alien delegates were already settling into their seats, their exoskeletons clicking softly against the polished surfaces, their sensory organs twitching with curiosity. They had questions, certainly. Questions about how a species that had evolved on a Deathworld, a planet so hostile that most carbon-based life should have been extinct within millennia, had managed not only to survive but to thrive, to develop civilization, and to reach the stars. None of them would receive the answers they expected. By the end of this summit, 3 galactic powers would be reconsidering their military doctrines, 2 trading consortiums would be rewriting their commercial treaties, and 1 ancient empire would be filing their first peace accord in 2,000 years. It all started the moment Marcus Chen walked through those chamber doors. Part 1. The Invitation and the Arrival. The message had arrived at the Earth Coalition's primary station 7 months prior, transmitted through quantum channels and verified by every encryption standard in the known galaxy. An official invitation to the Deathworld Summit, hosted on the neutral orbiting platform designated Sanctuary 7. The humans had never heard of the summit before, but their lead AI analyst, a consciousness that had emerged from the depths of Earth's data networks, had explained it quickly enough. Every 50 years, the major spacefaring civilizations convened to discuss the fates of primitive species that were beginning to show signs of cosmic awareness. The Deathworlders, as the attendees were ceremonially called, were the topic of significant debate. So few species emerged from truly hostile planetary environments, and even fewer did so with intact psychology and stable social structures. Marcus Chen had been selected as humanity's representative not because he was humanity's leader, that honor belonged to a collective council of elected officials and appointed experts, but because he was, in the opinion of the screening committee, the human most capable of not embarrassing his species in front of an audience of alien dignitaries. At 52 years old, Marcus had spent his entire adult life in diplomatic service. He had negotiated treaties between warring factions on Mars colonies, mediated resource disputes between Earth's continental governments, and even served as humanity's liaison to the first peaceful contact with the Xanthar Collective, a species that had initially approached Earth with the clear intention of subjugating its population. His record was spotless, his temperament was unflappable. His ability to think several moves ahead had become almost legendary among Earth's political circles. The journey to Sanctuary 7 had taken him through hyperspace 3 times, each transition a brief moment of disorientation but left him grateful for the pharmaceutical enhancements that kept human physiology stable during relativistic travel. The ship itself was a hybrid design, part human engineering, part technology borrowed from the more established civilizations. It was a beautiful vessel, sleek and functional, with observation decks that allowed Marcus to watch the approach to the summit station in real time. Sanctuary 7 was nothing like the images he'd been shown in briefing documents. It was larger, more complex, more breathtaking. The structure sprawled across several million cubic kilometers of space, a technological achievement that spoke to the combined capabilities of multiple advanced civilizations. Docking ports of varying shapes accommodated vessels from species that ranged from silicon-based to energy-based to crystalline consciousness matrices. The station hummed with activity, the constant movement of diplomatic delegations and their support staff creating a rhythm that felt almost alive. Marcus watched as a delegation of the Krell massive insectoid beings that had achieved space travel 250,000 years before humanity invented the wheel, floated past in their environmental bubbles. Nearby, the elegant, ethereal forms of the Atherin glided through transparent tubes, their bodies barely more than shimmering patterns of light given temporary substance. The human delegation numbered 17. Besides Marcus, there were 4 military observers, 3 scientists, 2 economists, and 7 support staff members. As they disembarked, Marcus was acutely aware of how small his team was compared to the delegations from other civilizations. The Corel had brought over 200 attendees. The trade coalition of Vespa had what appeared to be an entire administrative city staffed within their section of the station. But the brevity of the human delegation, Marcus knew, was by design. The coalition had made a strategic decision to present themselves as serious but understated, confident but not arrogant. First contact situations were delicate things, and the wrong impression could set the tone for centuries of interaction. The delegation was escorted to their quarters by an automated guide, a floating construct that communicated through a pleasant, gender-neutral voice that had been selected specifically to be non-threatening to human psychology. The quarters themselves were impressive. Each room had been customized based on the biological specifications that humans had provided during the initial registration. Temperature was optimal. Gravity was adjusted to match Earth standard. The lighting had been shifted slightly toward the warmer spectrum that humans found more comfortable. It was clear that someone had put considerable thought into the accommodations. Whether that thought had been driven by genuine hospitality or by a desire to keep the visiting aliens comfortable and docile remained to be seen. Marcus chose not to rest, despite the crew's obvious fatigue. Instead, he requested a tour of the station's public areas, dressed in the formal diplomatic uniform that had been specified in the dress code, a dark suit with subtle Earth Coalition insignia, selected specifically to project calm competence without appearing militaristic. The guide led him through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past chambers where hundreds of delegates were engaged in conversations, negotiations, and strategic discussions. What struck Marcus most powerfully was the sense of certainty that permeated everything. Every species he observed moved through the station with the confidence of beings who knew their place in the galactic hierarchy. The elder species, those whose records went back millions of years, carried themselves with the easy assurance of imperial power. The younger species, those who had achieved space travel only tens of thousands of years ago, moved with the careful courtesy of subordinates aware of their position. And the humans? They were observed, he realized, not with hostility, but with curiosity tinged with something else, something that took him several minutes to identify. Pity. The Krell diplomat he encountered in the observation lounge had been polite but distant. The member of the luminescent assembly had offered the standard courtesies but kept their distance as if uncertain whether humanity's atmosphere would be toxic to them. Even the traders from the Vespa Collective, a species known throughout the galaxy for their pragmatism and universal acceptance of different forms of life, had found reasons to excuse themselves quickly from conversation. Only one alien had engaged him in genuine dialogue, a representative of a species he didn't recognize initially. The being was vaguely humanoid in shape, though with proportions that suggested different gravity and atmospheric composition during its evolutionary history. Its skin was a deep bronze, and its eyes were a striking amber color that seemed to hold ancient wisdom and something that might have been amusement. "You're from Earth," the being had said without preamble. "Not a question. I am," Marcus had confirmed. Humanity is honored to be included in the summit. The bronze-skinned alien had made a sound that might have been laughter. Honored. Yes, that's a nice way to describe the invitation. I wonder if your people fully understand what they've been invited to witness. Marcus had felt the first stirrings of unease. I don't believe we've been introduced. What species? I'm one of the Sarketh. We're observers and historians. We make note of things that matter. Your species matters, Ambassador Chen, though perhaps not in the way your political leaders imagine. Before the summit concludes, you'll understand why. The Sarketh had moved away before Marcus could form a response, leaving him standing in the middle of the observation lounge with more questions than answers. That night, back in his quarters, Marcus reviewed the briefing materials one more time. The documents detailed the history of the Deathworld Summit, going back 230 years. 17 species had been called before it during that time. 7 had been extended full trade agreements and invited to join established alliances. 5 had been offered observer status while they developed their civilizations further. 3 had been declared unsuitable for integration and placed under restrictive oversight. 2 had proven impossible to categorize and had been assigned to special diplomatic committees for ongoing evaluation. None of the briefing materials explained why Deathworld species in particular were subjected to this scrutiny. None of them explained what made a world a death world in the first place. Marcus opened a secure channel back to Earth and sent an encrypted query to the Coalition's research division. The response came back within the hour, transmitted through tight quantum channels. According to everything that could be learned from public galactic records, A death world was any planet where the native evolutionary environment had produced conditions that made human-equivalent technological development statistically improbable. High gravity, thin atmosphere, extreme radiation, aggressive wildlife, parasitic threats, viral mutations, seismic activity that bordered on catastrophic. These were the hallmarks of a death world. Earth had virtually all of them. And yet Earth had produced not just survival, but civilization. That shouldn't have been possible. Marcus fell asleep trying to figure out exactly what he was walking into, unaware that his arrival had already triggered a chain of reactions that would reshape the political landscape of the entire known galaxy. In the encrypted strategic chambers beneath Sanctuary 7, the councils of the major civilizations were receiving their final briefings on humanity. And for the first time in recorded history, every single one of them was recommending that the Deathworld Summit be adjourned without reaching a consensus. No one could agree on how to classify humanity because humanity didn't fit into any of the established categories. De Corell wanted to make them subjects of study, to understand the biological and evolutionary pathways that had produced a species so improbably capable. The Luminescent Assembly wanted to contain them, to limit their access to certain technologies until they could verify that human psychology wouldn't pose a threat to galactic stability. The Trade Coalition wanted to recruit them, to use humanity's exceptional adaptability and problem-solving capacity as economic assets. The older empires wanted to absorb them into existing power structures before they could become too independent. And the Sarkev, those enigmatic historians and observers, said almost nothing about what they wanted. They simply noted that the humans had arrived and that everything that was about to happen was exactly what should happen. When Marcus Chen woke on the morning of his official presentation, he had no idea that he was about to become the most important figure in human history since the first civilizations had risen on Earth. He didn't know that what he was about to say would be quoted for centuries in academic institutions across the known galaxy. He didn't know that this moment would define not just humanity's place in the cosmos, but would force every major spacefaring civilization to reconsider what they thought they knew about consciousness, evolution, survival, and the true nature of strength. He only knew that his delegation needed him to be perfect, and that whatever was about to happen in that presentation chamber would change everything. He dressed carefully in his formal attire, took a moment to center his breathing and his thoughts, and walked toward the chamber where the Deathworld Summit was about to begin. Behind him, his team moved with disciplined precision. In front of him, the doors to the chamber opened silently, revealing a vast semicircular hall where delegates from 100 different species awaited his presentation. The room fell silent as he entered. 100 different types of sensory organs focused on him. The temperature seemed to drop, or perhaps that was just his human nervous system registering the weight of attention bearing down on him. Marcus walked to the center of the chamber, to the presentation platform that had been prepared for humanity's first official address to the galactic community. He took a breath, steadied himself, and prepared to explain exactly why humanity's invitation to the summit had been both the most predictable decision the galactic councils had ever made and simultaneously their first mistake. The Deathworld Summit welcomed humanity. Part 2. When Marcus opened his mouth to speak, he made a conscious choice not to begin with the prepared remarks that his advisory team had drafted over the past 6 months. Instead, he began with a question. Not a rhetorical question designed to make a point, but a genuine inquiry delivered with the tone of someone who honestly wanted an answer. How many of you in this chamber have read the ecological data from Earth? The silence that followed was somehow heavier than the silence before. Marcus could sense the delegation leaders looking toward each other, their various forms of non-verbal communication firing across the chamber. Chemical signals, electromagnetic pulses, subtle shifts in bioluminescence. The Krell's antennae twitched. The luminescent assembly's members flickered in what might have been confusion. Finally, one of the Atheran spoke, their voice like wind chimes made manifest in reality. We have reviewed the preliminary assessments. The geological records indicate a world of significant environmental stress. Your species has demonstrated remarkable adaptive capacity to overcome such conditions. This is something you've never seen before, Marcus interrupted gently, not rudely, but with the tone of someone who had suddenly realized that politeness was far less important than honesty. And you haven't read the full data, because the full data would have taken you 3 months to process, and you only arrived here 3 days ago. I understand. The briefing packets are voluminous, but I need you to understand what you're looking at with fresh eyes, not through the lens of summarization and analysis. He activated the presentation interface, and holographic data began to fill the chamber. First came images of Earth itself, rotating slowly, and even in the sterile format of scientific visualization, Marcus could feel the alien delegates' reactions shift. Earth was not beautiful by galactic standards. It was overcrowded with life, the oceans churning with more biological density than most species would consider sustainable. The continents covered in vegetation that seemed almost obscene in its profusion. The data stream showed the composition, the gravitational force at 1.2 Earth standard, the magnetic field fluctuations that created constant auroral storms in the upper atmosphere, the seismic activity that manifested in earthquakes and volcanic eruptions across every populated continent. 70% of Earth's surface is covered with water, Marcus continued. The oceans host thousands of large predator species. Some of them are capable of eating a human being. Many of them are willing to. The continents host their own variety of predators, parasites, and poisonous organisms. The weather patterns are violent and unpredictable. The average year sees hurricanes that would destroy 90% of the structures built by species who evolved on worlds with calmer atmospheres. Earthquakes reshape the landscape regularly. Volcanoes erupt without warning. And yet, humanity didn't just survive. We thrived. We built cities. We created art. We developed philosophy and science and systems of government that allowed us to work together despite our predatory nature. The data shifted, showing not just current ecological data but historical records. Carefully reconstructed timelines of human evolution, showing the species moving from prey animals hunted by megafauna to tool users learning to hunt their predators, to civilizations built on agriculture, to the eventual development of technology, and eventually space exploration. Every single major step in our evolutionary and cultural development occurred because of the hostile environment we evolved in. We became intelligent, in part, because we had to be smarter than the things trying to kill us. We developed language because we needed to coordinate hunts against predators that were individually more powerful than we were. We created communities because solitary humans on Earth don't live very long. We discovered medicine because our homeworld is full of pathogens that would have killed our entire species without it. We learned engineering because we needed to build structures strong enough to withstand the earthquakes and storms that Earth regularly inflicted upon us. Everything that makes humanity capable, everything that you've observed in our development, it all came from survival. Marcus paused, letting the weight of the data settle over the assembled delegates. He could see the calculation happening in their various forms of consciousness. The Corel were already modulating their communication frequencies, sharing what they were processing. The luminescent assembly was flickering in what he was now certain was the equivalent of intense discussion. The older empires, the ones who had been in space for millions of years and had assumed they understood the full spectrum of possible civilizations, were strangely silent. We are not unique because we come from a death world, Marcus said carefully. We are unique because we are the first species from a death world who has survived long enough to reach the stars while retaining what we needed to survive in the first place. A hand rose from the Trade Coalition section, a gesture that had been universally adopted as a sign of requested audience, regardless of species. One of the Vesper traders, their sleek amphibious form shifting restlessly in their environmental fluid, spoke in the carefully modulated tones of someone trained in commercial negotiation. Ambassador, you're implying that previous Deathworld species have either not survived to reach space travel or have lost essential survival capabilities in the process. This contradicts what we understood about the data. The Corel, before you invited them to speak, were suggesting that the environmental conditions on your world were perhaps not as extreme as initially assessed, that our understanding of Deathworlds might itself be flawed. Marcus smiled. He had been waiting for this objection, had in fact hoped for it. This was the moment where his presentation stopped being about data and started being about truth. The Corel are correct. Our understanding of Deathworlds is incomplete, he said. He brought up new data, this time showing the historical records of all 17 species that had previously been called before the Deathworld Summit. Here are the records of the 17 species before humanity who evolved on worlds classified as Deathworlds. Here are their technological trajectories, their social development, their current status in the galactic community. The data told a story that the assembled delegates hadn't necessarily wanted to confront. 15 of the 17 Deathworld species had either failed to achieve space travel at all, or had achieved it only to collapse back into pre-technological existence within a few generations. Of those 15, 12 had been specifically noted as demonstrating behavioral instabilities, aggression toward their own kind at levels that exceeded what most galactic observers considered normal. difficulty in forming stable social structures, rapid burnout of leadership classes, oscillating between cooperation and conflict. The remaining 17%, a single species that had achieved stable civilization on a hostile world, had done so by essentially becoming risk-averse to the point of paralysis. The Yenth had reached space travel, had made contact with the broader galactic community, and had immediately sought the most restrictive treaties possible. They had voluntarily confined their expansion, limited their technological development, and essentially turned themselves into a civilization dedicated to avoiding anything that might constitute a risk. They were stable. They were also, by any honest assessment, terrified of their own existence. The historical data suggests that Deathworld evolution produces pathological outcomes, Marcus explained. Species that evolve in truly hostile environments tend to develop either extreme aggression or extreme caution. The aggression comes from needing to view competitors as threats to survival. The caution comes from learning that taking risks on a hostile world usually means death. Neither of these traits tends to produce civilizations that play well with others.
He brought up the Earth data one more time, zooming in on different regions, different time periods.
Humanity had a different evolutionary pathway. We are by nature cooperative. Extremely cooperative. We can also be extremely aggressive, but only when we perceive a genuine threat. Because Earth was so hostile, we learned something that most Deathworld species apparently struggle with. The recognition that cooperation with your own kind is a more effective survival strategy than competition. We evolved to form groups, to value loyalty, to see the other humans in our tribe as more important than individual gain, and that cooperative instinct, that ability to work together, scaled. It allowed us to move beyond tribal structures into larger civilizations. We learned to compromise. We learned to trade. We learned to negotiate. These aren't instincts for us, they're learned behaviors that we practice and refine constantly. But the learning is driven by something fundamental. We know that we cannot survive alone. We never could. Not. A member of the ancient Valorian Empire stood, their towering form easily 3 meters tall, their exoskeleton a deep crimson that seemed to absorb light, addressing the chamber with the tone of someone accustomed to being listened to without question. You are proposing that humanity's history of conflict and cooperation makes them superior partners for alliance than other Deathworld species? The question was posed as if the very idea was somehow offensive.
I'm proposing that we're different.
Marcus replied, not better, different. We are a Deathworld species that learned to trust each other before we learned to distrust everything else. Most species reach space travel and then make their first contact with the broader galaxy already fully formed. Their social structures, their psychological templates, their understanding of what constitutes acceptable behavior are all locked in place. We're arriving at that moment in our development where we're still malleable. We still see our own species as the primary in-group, which means we're predisposed to work with humans before we work with outsiders. But we've also evolved the capacity to expand that in-group to include non-humans. We've been doing it since we left Africa. We incorporated people from every continent into a global civilization. We've been practicing the art of accepting beings that are different from us for our entire history. Another delegate stood, this one from the collective consciousness known as the Unity, a species that had achieved biological fusion and now operated as a singular, distributed intelligence across multiple bodies. You present cooperation as a virtue, yet your historical records show extensive warfare between human factions. You've used weapons of mass destruction against your own kind. You've conducted genocide. You've enslaved other humans. The psychological profile of your species suggests you are capable of extraordinary cruelty toward groups you define as other. Why should we believe that these destructive tendencies will not extend to your interaction with alien species? It was a fair question, and Marcus had anticipated it. He had actually requested this presentation happen in this order precisely so he could address it while the evidence was still fresh in everyone's minds. Because we've already proven that we can overcome those tendencies, he said simply. Earth in the pre-industrial era was a planet of constant warfare. We had weapons, and we used them against each other. We had reasons for conflict, resources, territory, ideological differences, simple fear of the unknown. In the last 200 years, with the development of weapon systems so destructive that they threatened our own extinction, we were forced to choose. and we chose cooperation. It wasn't inevitable. It took tremendous effort. But we chose to see each other as humans first, and Earthlings of different nations second. That choice has held for generations now. We're not perfect. We still have conflict. But we learned that the cost of not cooperating was too high to pay. Marcus paused, then delivered the final element of his prepared remarks, the moment where his presentation shifted from data and defense to something more fundamental. You invited us here to determine if humanity is a civilization you could trust, if humanity represents a stable addition to the galactic community, or a potential threat. What I'm telling you is that you've been asking the wrong question. You should not be asking whether humanity can be trusted. You should be asking whether your civilization has the adaptability that humanity has developed. Because the galaxy isn't static. It's changing. New species will reach space travel. New technologies will emerge. New threats will appear. And the civilizations that will survive and thrive in the face of change are the ones that can cooperate, that can trust each other, that can override their instinct toward dominance and learn to work as equals. Humanity learned that on a Deathworld where we had no choice. And now we're bringing that lesson to the galaxy. The chamber erupted in what could only be described as chaos, though it was the carefully controlled chaos of delegates who had been professionally trained to discuss controversial topics without violence. The Krell were accelerating their communication frequencies to almost inaudible levels. The luminescent assembly was flickering like a strobe light. The older empires were engaged in rapid consultations with their advisory staff. Only the Sarketh and the Aetherin seemed unsurprised, as if they had anticipated exactly this moment. Marcus returned to his seat, and as he did, he caught the eye of the Sarketh who had spoken to him in the observation lounge. The alien was making that sound that might have been laughter again. And Marcus finally understood. The Sarketh had known this would happen. Whoever they were, whatever their role in the broader galactic community, they had invited humanity here not because they wanted to evaluate humans. They had invited them here because they wanted the established civilizations to be forced to reevaluate themselves. They wanted the shock that would come when a young species, barely into space travel, showed the assembled delegates of the galaxy exactly what they had lost in their quest for dominance and stability. The Deathworld Summit, Marcus realized, was about to become something it had never been before. Not a judgment of humanity, but a judgment of everyone else. And no one in the chamber had any idea what was about to happen next. The Deathworld Summit welcomed humanity. Part 3. The Secondary Chambers of Sanctuary. 7 had been designed with the assumption that all substantive discussion at the Deathworld Summit would occur in the main presentation hall. The drafters of the station's specifications had not anticipated that a species would arrive and, in a single afternoon, force every major alliance and power block in known space to demand emergency closed-door sessions with their respective advisory staff. By nightfall, the secondary chambers, small conference rooms designed to accommodate delegations of 20 or fewer, were all occupied. By midnight, the station's administrators had opened the tertiary chambers, spaces that had been constructed for ceremonial purposes only, and repurposed them for the intense negotiations that had broken out across the galactic community. Marcus remained in the human delegation's quarters, watching the chaos unfold through the station's information networks. He had been explicitly instructed by the Coalition Council on Earth not to engage in any further negotiations until he had received direction from home. The quantum communication with Earth would take several hours, given the distance. But Marcus knew that by the time morning came to Sanctuary 7, he would have his marching orders. For now, the best thing he could do was rest and try to understand what exactly had happened in that chamber. His tactical advisor, a woman named Commander Sarah Okonkwo, had been present for the presentation and had immediately recognized what Marcus had done. She was sitting across from him now, a tablet of encrypted notes floating in front of her, her military training evident in the precision with which she had documented the reactions of each delegation. You forced them to question themselves, Okonkwo said simply. You presented humanity as a solution to a problem they didn't know they had. And now they're panicking because they can't decide if the solution is more dangerous than the problem. Was that the right choice? Marcus asked. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He respected Okonkwo's judgment. She had been his military liaison for 3 years and had shown an uncanny ability to predict how different species would react to certain stimuli. I don't know yet, Okonkwo admitted, but I'll tell you what's happening right now. Every delegation is reviewing their own civilization's internal dynamics, and they're all reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. They've built systems of governance that are optimized for stability and dominance, not for adaptation and cooperation. The Krell Empire built itself on the concept of absolute hierarchy. The luminescent assembly is based on perfect consensus, which means any individual deviation from the collective intelligence is treated as a threat. The Valorian Empire is a military dictatorship that's been in power for so long they've forgotten how to question their own decisions. Even the Trade Coalition, for all their pragmatism, operates on the assumption that they need to dominate the market or they'll be consumed by it. She pulled up data on her tablet, showing the documented instances where each major power had encountered a problem they couldn't solve, a situation that required adaptation they were psychologically unprepared to make. The Krell lost an entire colony to a plague because their hierarchical structure prevented the lower caste workers from communicating the warning signs fast enough before it got out of control. The luminescent assembly went into a state of near collapse during the Sirius crisis because reaching consensus on emergency response took 6 months, and by then the situation had evolved beyond their ability to respond. The Valorian Empire has been facing a slow economic decline for the past 1,000 years because they're too rigid to adapt to market changes they didn't anticipate. Each of them is looking at humanity's cooperative model and thinking the same thing. What if we'd done things differently? Marcus understood now why the Sarkith had been so amused. The historians had essentially loaded a philosophical bomb into the summit and let humanity detonate it. The question wasn't whether humans could be trusted. The question was whether the established galactic order could survive if humanity, a young species with radical ideas about cooperation and adaptation, actually became a full member of the broader community. The implications of that question were destabilizing to every established power structure. The response from Earth arrived early the next morning, delivered through a quantum channel secured with encryption protocols that would have taken any other civilization centuries to break. The message was simple. Marcus was authorized to accept any and all offers of alliance, trade, or partnership that came his way. More importantly, he was authorized to make offers of his own. The Coalition Council had made a strategic decision. If the galactic community wanted to learn how humans managed cooperation and adaptation, then humanity would teach them, but at a price. When Marcus returned to the main chamber for the second day of the summit, he was not alone. He had brought Okenko and 4 other members of his delegation, a cultural anthropologist, an economist, a neuroscientist, and 1 additional member whose presence at the summit had been kept deliberately vague. The Krell protocols that governed these proceedings did technically allow for expanded delegations during secondary negotiations, though it was extremely unusual for a delegation to expand on the second day rather than contract. The first offer came from the Trade Coalition of Vespa. They wanted access to human economic models, specifically the systems that allowed humans to distribute resources across vast populations without triggering the kind of resource conflicts that had historically plagued their own species. In exchange, they offered advanced technology, capital investment in human infrastructure, and guaranteed markets for human goods. It was a fair offer, presented with the kind of precision that suggested they had spent the entire previous night calculating what humans would accept. Marcus listened to the proposal, then countered with something more specific. The Trade Coalition could have access to human economic models, yes, but they would have to accept human advisors embedded within their trading networks, individuals who could teach their species not just how to implement the systems, but how to think about the underlying principles. The Trade Coalition's initial reaction was resistance. The idea of alien beings influencing their internal structures was uncomfortable, but Marcus watched as their lead negotiator calculated the cost-benefit analysis and realized that having access to genuine cooperative trading networks would generate exponentially more profit than the cost of accepting a few human advisors. The agreement was tentatively signed before noon. The second offer came from the Luminescent Assembly, and it was far more complex. The Assembly recognized that their collective consciousness model had limitations that human cooperative structures had apparently overcome. They wanted access to human cognitive architecture, specifically the ability to maintain individual identity while participating in group consensus. It was, Marcus realized, a request that touched on the fundamental question of what made humanity different. He brought in his neuroscientist, Dr. Amanda Reeves, and together they explained the concept of what human psychology called the balance between individual and collective. Humans could think independently, could maintain unique perspectives and opinions, but could still choose to work together toward common goals. They didn't require biological fusion or perfect consciousness merging. They simply required enough empathy and enough desire for cooperation to override their individual interests when necessary. The luminescent assembly found this concept almost unbearably beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. They spent 4 hours in debate, their collective intelligence working through the implications. Finally, they proposed an experiment. A small group of their beings would voluntarily separate from the collective consciousness and remain in contact with humanity for a period of time, learning how human-style cooperation worked. In exchange, they would grant humanity access to the accumulated knowledge of their collective consciousness, which had been in operation for over 2 million years. By the time the third offer came, from the Valorian Empire, proposing something that sounded almost revolutionary for a military dictatorship, a joint governance council with humans that would allow for more rapid decision-making and adaptation, Marcus realized that the entire structure of the galactic political order was shifting in real time. He was witnessing the moment when a young species, barely out of its home system, was effectively forcing every established power to reconsider the fundamental principles upon which they had built their civilizations. The only major delegation that did not come forward with an offer was the oldest and most powerful, the ancient empires that had ruled the known galaxy for millions of years. They remained silent, their representatives observing but not engaging, their protocols suggesting that they were in some form of internal discussion that involved councils that existed beyond even this chamber. By the end of the second day, Marcus was exhausted and slightly dizzy from the rapid pace of negotiations. He had agreed to 3 major alliances, signed preliminary agreements for technology transfer and cultural exchange, and inadvertently become the spokesperson for a philosophical revolution. When he finally returned to the human quarters, he found a message waiting that made him stop cold. The Sarketh historian had requested a private audience with him in the observation lounge. Alone, Marcus arrived to find the bronze-skinned alien already there, watching Earth rotate below once again, just as Marcus had done on his first night at the station. "You understand what you've done?" the Sarketh asked without preamble. "I've made opening offers," Marcus replied carefully. "I've begun the process of integrating humanity into the broader galactic community." "You've done far more than that," the Sarketh said. They turned to face Marcus directly, and for the first time, he saw them with what he could only describe as clarity. The aliens' form seemed somehow more defined, their presence more substantial, as if by moving they had revealed something they had previously been hiding. "You've given every established power in this galaxy permission to question whether their way of organizing society is the only way to organize society. You've presented a young species that is still malleable, still learning, still growing, and you've shown that this malleability might be a strength rather than a weakness. You've done something that would have taken 1,000 years of gradual cultural exchange and philosophical debate. You've done it in 36 hours. Is that bad?" Marcus asked. The Sarketh made that sound like laughter again, but this time it was different. There was genuine warmth in it, and something that might have been pride. "It's inevitable," the Sarketh replied. "And we needed it. All of us." The galaxy had become stagnant, you see. We historians had been documenting the slow decline of innovation, the gradual ossification of thought, the way that as civilizations grew older and more powerful, they also became more set in their ways. But you humans, you arrived at just the right moment, with just the right combination of traits. You are young enough to believe change is possible. You are strong enough to not be destroyed by that change. And you are cooperative enough to share the lessons you've learned. It was only a matter of time before one of you figured out that the real power in this galaxy isn't military strength or technological advancement. It's the ability to make people want to listen to you. Marcus wanted to ask more, wanted to understand who the Sarketh really were and what their role in all of this had been. But before he could form the questions, the alien had turned back to watch Earth rotate below. "The ancient empires will not come to you," the Sarketh said quietly. "Not for a long time. Your success has threatened something fundamental about how they understand power. But others will. And with each new species that adopts human models of cooperation, the pressure on the ancient empires will grow. In 100 years, perhaps in 50, those empires will have to choose whether to adapt or whether to be left behind. And that choice, that ability to choose adaptation, will be the greatest gift your species could have given to a galaxy that had begun to believe that change was no longer possible. The Saketh remained at the observation lounge viewport, and Marcus found himself doing the same. Together, they watched Earth rotate beneath them, blue and alive and impossibly fragile, the birthplace of a species that had learned something essential about survival, that the strongest tool for enduring a hostile universe wasn't strength or speed or superior intelligence, but the simple choice to work together. That lesson, it seemed, was about to reshape the entire galactic political order. By the time the Deathworld Summit officially concluded, 3 days later humanity had signed binding treaties with 12 major species and preliminary agreements with 37 others. No species had been banned or restricted. Instead, the summit had transformed into something it had never been intended to be. Not a judgment of a young civilization, but a celebration of what that civilization could teach the older members of the galactic community. As the human delegation prepared to return to Earth, Marcus stood in the docking bay and watched Sanctuary 7 recede into the distance. In the weeks and months to come, there would be criticism from some quarters. Military analysts would suggest that humanity had given away too much, that the agreements were disadvantageous. Economic experts would argue about the terms of trade. Political scientists would debate the long-term implications of the alliances humanity had made. But in the observation logs of that station, in the records maintained by the Saketh and their historians, the moment would be noted as the pivotal point in galactic history. The moment when a young species from a death world arrived at the center of power and effectively taught every established civilization that the only true weakness was the inability to change. From that moment forward, the known galaxy would never be the same again. Change that had seemed impossible became inevitable. Adaptation, once avoided as a threat to stability, became recognized as the only path to genuine survival. And it had all started with one human ambassador asking the wrong question at exactly the right time, and then having the courage to answer the questions that came after with complete honesty. The Deathworld Summit had indeed welcomed humanity, but in doing so, they had unwittingly invited the agent of transformation that would eventually reshape everything they thought they knew about themselves, their civilization, and what it meant to be part of a galaxy that was finally learning how to grow.